Let's talk about the hoax of Jacko, the British Columbia gorilla, because everyone's commented on it from Grover Krantz to John Green, and I'm here to put in my 2 cents. Now, I'm going to put the link in the description for this book, Yale and the Strange Story of Jacko the Ape-Boy. This is a fantastic resource. I don't agree with all of the conclusions in the book, but especially if you're not from British Columbia, this is invaluable because they actually go to the area and take a bunch of pictures and include those in the book. So I do want to leave the link for that if you're interested. I will also leave the link to the original article in the Daily Colonist. That's on archive.org, so it is available to anybody. And it's a long read if you want it. If you want to go through it, it's quite a saga, to be honest, of how they supposedly captured this guy. But the important parts are that Jacko was 4'7", 127 pounds, covered in a 1 inch of black glossy hair, and had a forearm that was slightly longer than a human forearm. He's supposedly very, very strong, was in the care of George Tilbury of Yale, and under the guidance of Dr. Hanlington, the local doctor, as far as diet, loved berries and milk, but was not given any raw meats because they were afraid that it would make him savage. Firstly, I want to discuss whether this happened in 1882 or 1884. 1882 was listed by the Daily Colonist in their initial printing, but I don't think that was intentional. I think that was a typo. All of the reprints in all of the other newspapers across the US and Canada do mention 1884. I also want to discuss something that they briefly mentioned in Yale and the Strange Story of Jacko the Ape-Boy, is that they said it would be impossible for the report from Yale to get to Victoria in a day because the report was dated July 3rd. I personally think that the timeline is that July 3rd is actually the receipt date in Victoria, not the send date from Yale. There was also a printing on July 4th in the Tacoma Daily Ledger in Tacoma, Washington. It was just a couple of sentences, but basically said that the Colonist was coming out with this big report, which they then printed the full report on July 9th. Now, July 3rd to July 4th, just from Yale to Victoria may be fast, but Yale to Tacoma, that's even faster. So I do think that July 3rd is the receipt date in Yale. The receipt date in Victoria. I think Victoria Daily Colonist reporter goes, "Ooh, wow, this is fantastic. This is a crazy story. This is something that we should tell people about." So they sent either telegram, telegraph, whatever they had at the time, over to Tacoma and just said, "Hey, we've got this story coming out tomorrow. Just wanted to give you the heads up." They publish a sentence or two, as I said, and then they wait and get the full report later. That's the timeline that makes most sense to me. I don't think it's like a debunking to say that the report could not have possibly gotten to Yale, from Yale to Victoria in a day, because I don't think that I don't think we should have that expectation. As far as whether this is a real report, I don't think that it was. I think this is a hoax, and let me explain why. In British Columbia, there are two main relict hominoid types, one being the Pacific Northwest Sasquatch, Patty, and the other being the Neanderthaloid. Well, I've certainly commented on the Neanderthaloid in the context of Georgia because I'm from Georgia and have mostly studied our sightings, but the Neanderthaloid is very much in the folklore of the Athabascan peoples of Canada and Alaska, and they would refer to him as the Bushman, or sometimes translated as the Bad Indian, but essentially it's a human but hairy. And so these are the two types that we really need to consider. There is a potential for like a four-toed giant that's even bigger than a Sasquatch, but since Jacko's only 4'7", I think just considering the Sasquatch size would be fine. We don't need to consider something even bigger just to determine if this was real or not. So let's take Jacko at 4'7" and 127 pounds, compare him to the CDC growth charts. 4'7" is the median height for a 10-year-old boy. The median weight for a 10-year-old boy is 70 pounds, not 127. So the Neanderthaloid, which is, yes, a little bit bulkier, a little bit larger than a human, but essentially human proportion, especially in a prepubescent, we would not expect to see any difference between a human and a Neanderthaloid in height weight proportions. There's no way that this would have been a Neanderthaloid. So you're looking at a Sasquatch potentially, in the sense of the bulk of a Sasquatch is much, much greater than that of a human. But how old would a 4'7" Sasquatch be? Well, the closest thing we have is Robert Wadlow. He got to 8'11" when he died at age 22. Could have probably kept growing considering the pituitary tumor, but he got to 8'11", and he's very well documented. So we know for every year he got older, we know how tall he was and how much he weighed. He is the best resource we have for how to get to 9 feet tall. He was 4'6.5" and 75 pounds at age 2. 2. I have had a 2-year-old, and I definitely would not have let her out of my sight long enough for her to fall off a cliff and then me not go after her. That's insane to me. Primarily, our sightings are of males. Like, wildly disproportionate number of relict hominoid sightings of all types are males. And that makes sense because the males go out, they scout, they hunt, they protect. The females are the ones staying home with, especially if they have young juveniles to take care of, they're going to be, just hanging out around camp kind of thing. Even species like the wolf and the lion, where the women do the hunting, or the females, not women, but females who do the hunting. When they have young juveniles, like, they have to wait until their pups are old enough to stay by themselves for a little while before they can return to the hunt. They don't just give birth and then go out hunting the next day, right? So if we look then at great apes, gorilla has a lifespan that's roughly half the human lifespan, like 35 years. They don't start weaning until 3 to 6 is their period of weaning. So the idea that even a relict hominoid that had a lifespan half that of a human would be casually leaving a 2-year-old alone to fall off a cliff, and just whatever. No. You'd be having a female Sasquatch down there ripping that train apart. As a parent, I just don't see that happening. So then, if it's not a relict hominoid, it's either a misidentification or a hoax. Say you did actually capture something. I'm pretty sure you're going to identify that animal pretty quickly. They know what bears look like. Even a mangy bear is not going to look like a human. So the idea that it would be a misidentification is also, no, I don't think that's possible either. So we're looking at a hoax. And who would have perpetrated that hoax? Well, certainly the obvious answer is the Daily Colonist, and all of the other newspapers thought that it was the Daily Colonist. I don't think that's the case. Let me tell you why. George Tilbury is supposed to have been the wild man keeper. He didn't live in Yale. Never did. He was a veterinarian from Victoria. How'd they get that wrong? Well, George Tilbury actually was known to the Daily Colonist because he was someone who advertised in the Daily Colonist. There was a man in the British Columbia Directory for 1884 to 1885 that had a similar last name and just happened to work in the machine shops where Jacko was supposedly unloaded. And that was W. Tilley. I think that the people of Yale, or someone in Yale, wrote the report, sent it to Victoria. The name accidentally got changed in Victoria by the Daily Colonist new reporters who were familiar with George Tilbury and maybe got the names mixed up in their heads. Either way, George Tilbury is the one that was published, but it couldn't have been him. So there's definitely a report from somewhere else. My guess would be Yale, because they would be familiar with Mr. Tilley and the fact that he worked in the machine shop. Now, by 1887, Mr. Tilley was still living in Yale, so chances are he didn't strike it big selling a wild man to the circus folk back east or in London, as they said in the report. Mr. Tilley is also a reason that I don't think the report could have happened in 1882, because Mr. Tilley was not living in Yale in 1882. He shows up in 1884. So I do think we have a report from 1884 from Yale that lists Mr. Tilley as the keeper, and then that just gets discombobulated in the printing in Victoria. Interestingly, we also have an article in the Daily Colonist almost 2 months after that initial report saying that a man from Yale who had been reported as the wild man's keeper essentially was saying that he would appreciate everyone kindly effing off and not bothering him because he didn't have a wild man to sell them. It doesn't make sense if you're George Tilbury to come and say, hey, I don't have the wild man, and them not print your name, or the fact that you're not even from Yale. They should have gotten that corrected by then. So I think what they had was W. Tilley coming in saying, hey, I don't have the wild man. And them going, this isn't even the guy that we reported. So they didn't publish his name because they didn't want to admit that they had been wrong.
It's actually really sad because George Tilbury ended up having a nervous breakdown and dying in September of that year. And you wonder how much this whole experience played a role in that outcome.
But why would W. Tilley come and say, hey, I don't have the wild man, if he was never reported as having the wild man? Because he thought he had been reported as the wild man. He either knew about or was involved in the plot to send this report to Victoria, and he never read the Daily Colonist to know that he was not actually reported. So he was saying that he was getting calls about the wild man when he didn't realize that he was never even attached by name to the story. So we have some sort of conspiracy in Yale, and W. Tilley is involved. Why? Yale was a boom town going bust. It had been a gold town. At the time, it was being used by Andrew Onderdonk as kind of a base of operations for his Canadian Pacific Railroad offices, I guess you could say. But the writing was on the wall. Once the Canadian Pacific Railroad was done, Yale was dead. And so I think this was one last attempt to boost tourism to Yale. Problem is, it just didn't work.